So, the climate crisis is already here. I think probably everybody in this room has noticed that. We have superstorms that are just devastating areas on the planet. We have huge droughts. We have climate migration going on, floods, wildfires, all those things. But all of that's going to seem like nothing in a few decades if we don't turn around really fast. We're going to have 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. And just for folks more Fahrenheit oriented, 3.5 in Celsius is 6.3 degrees increase in temperature Fahrenheit. And when we have that, we are going to see storms like we've never seen before constantly. We're going to have droughts that leave entire areas deserts, which means less food for everybody. We're going to have endless, huge wildfires. We're going to see the coasts underwater and all those people and all those farmlands as well underwater. We're going to have a fifth of the world's population being climate migrants. So we absolutely have to act really fast. Even the United Nations Climate Commission, which can only say what the politics of the different UN countries allow it to say, even that commission is saying we have 12 years to turn things around. By 2030, we have to have 45% less emissions than in 2010. So this is a huge deal requiring massive transformation. And a lot of people say they're being a little bit optimistic. So you can debate how much time we have, but everybody agrees. Everybody except for a few oil industry funded individuals and people fooled by them. Everybody agrees we don't have time. We have to act fast. So that's why we're having this forum. It's an eco-socialist perspective on what we have to do. And we're going to have 4 different speakers, each affiliated with a different socialist organization. I'm going to introduce each person. Each person will speak 10, 15 minutes, and then we're going to have discussion.
The Green New Deal is an idea that started in 2006 as a Green Party platform. The idea was that we would combine the Marshall Plan or the New Deal, this idea of like jobs and pro-working class agenda with the environmental struggle. And there isn't really any specific like Green New Deal. Everybody has a different idea right now of what the Green New Deal is, but some common themes are basically like a guaranteed job or like improvements in the life of the working class. It was popularized by a lot of books and propaganda over the years. Notably, it's been pushed by the Sunrise Movement. I heard that there are some people here from the Sunrise Movement, so shout out. And also popularized by This Changes Everything, which is over there, if you want to buy that. The Green New Deal that has come out most recently is actually a resolution put together by Senator Representative Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Let's see. In terms of why we need a Green New Deal, I think Carol put that in very clear terms. So before we go into like how, like what a Green New Deal would do and why it would fix the problem, we need to identify what the problem is. And the problem, you know, of course, from a socialist perspective is the capitalist. So capital is, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, capital is essentially any productive forces which a capitalist uses to expand their business and then reinvest and expand their capital over and over again. So every time that you expand productive forces, you need to use more energy to do that. And of course, we live on a finite planet, so you can't expand energy production infinitely on an exponential basis without having any negative side effects. So accordingly, since 1970, energy production has increased 140%. Biodiversity in tandem has declined 50%, and the Earth has warmed 0.8 degrees Celsius. And to make it clear that it is actually the businesses that are using the vast majority of our resources, here are just some statistics. 87% of the water used in this country is used by either industrial or agricultural uses. 62% of the electricity in this country is used for commercial or industrial uses. And even the electricity that's used by people who are living in their homes. It's not exactly a choice to use that electricity because of the way that our cities have been laid out, so that we wastefully have to use air conditioning, cars, etc. And it's also important for us to note that all forms of energy production have some form of environmental damage. So, you know, a lot of the solutions that are put out is like, oh, we'll just switch over to solar panels, or we'll just switch over to wind or whatever, overlooking even just the ability, like the logistics of supplying energy for that. The environmental damage of switching over to those things under capitalism is not necessarily less. In fact, just from the solar panels and other electronics which have been produced, which require rare earth metals, the rare earth mining that has been going on in China has caused so much damage that their Ministry of the Environment says, it estimates that it would take 75 years for them to clean it up. And that's like today. So, you know, we're not even close to using anywhere near as many solar panels as like they would say. So essentially the only way that we can combat this problem is by reducing our energy consumption to some degree. And of course, that's going to be very unacceptable to the majority of the population, given the way that energy is and its products are distributed today. The poor, the working class, the people who are oppressed in this society are not going to be able to take the extra taxes, the extra payments it's going to take for us to switch to some kind of like sustainable capitalism, if such a thing could even exist. And the case for that is made locally by the failure of 1631 and internationally by the Yellow Vest movement, who essentially started revolting because of diesel taxes. So if we're going to found a movement, we need to take on the issues of oppression and the issues of inequality, the issues of racism, classism, misogyny, etc. These sorts of things need to be central to the way that we think about the climate crisis, because these issues are not separate. They are caused by the same thing, and if we don't address the way that they interact with the issues of the climate crisis, and if we don't take that up as a central part of the way that we deal with the issue, then we are going to fail. So in terms of like policy recommendations or like things that I've seen that I like some of Sean Scott's proposals. Affordable housing, I think, would be a really good thing. It would reduce our car culture. It would make it much easier for people to commute to work. I like having bike networks and public transit. Of course, taxing the rich, I think, is something that we could all agree with. Another thing that I think is like really important for us to mention is that the indigenous people in this country have been on the front lines of climate change and environmental damage since the very beginning. And they have been the most reliable opponents to all negative environmental like changes in our society. And so one of the most important things that we could do is to turn over the land back to them and to give them the management of the lands that they have held ancestrally for years. Let's see. Some other things that we could do. So in terms of like the policies that, like beyond the policies, what we need to do is talk about a strategy for like actually winning these things, because obviously, as I explained before, the ruling class, the capitalists, are not going to like any of the proposals that would actually start to address these problems. And so how are we going to fight back against the capitalists? the environmental movement over its like recent history has kind of bifurcated into two different tendencies largely. Before the rise of socialism in these past few years, essentially the class collaborationists like the Environmental Defense Fund and other like big NGOs have decided that they can work with business to try to convince them to regulate themselves, and that's not worked out super well. And then groups like Earth First and other radical environmental groups tried, ecotage and to like blow up industrial machinery and things like that to prevent environmental damage. And predictably, the U.S. government won the contest of violence. So I think what we need to do is focus on organizing the working class and bringing forth policies that that benefit them, and taking a central role of organizing with the people who are working in extractive industries. I don't think that we shouldn't be working against fishermen. We shouldn't be working against the people who are mining who are doing coal mining. We need to talk to them and help them understand what the issues are, and then we need to be able to provide them with an alternative way to make a living. Because if polluting the earth is the only way that they can make a living, then that's what they're going to do, and there's nothing that we can do to stop them. So we need to change the game. And of course, the final thing that we could do, of course, is to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism. Socialism produces for use value instead of for exchange value, so they don't have any need to overproduce. In fact, they have incentive not to overproduce, because why would you do extra work? So that's pretty much everything that I think needs to happen. We've got 10 years, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for organizing this tonight. I think, don't need to go super in depth into the environmental catastrophe that we face, but I think it's just more and more becoming a visible part of people's lives. Extreme, once-in-a-lifetime weather is now becoming the new normal. Every year, we hear about worst ever hurricanes and cyclones, and there's this catastrophic flooding. We saw this spring in the Midwest, and the IPCC report last year, I think, that was already mentioned, is something that really, I think, kind of lit a fire in a lot of people. Warning, we have 12 years or less to avoid disastrous climate catastrophe. And I think this is combined with the complete failure of the political establishment to do anything remotely addressing the scale of what's needed to address this crisis. I think Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish activist who's been inspiring people across the world to take action, said it really well when she said, "The one thing we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action. Then and only then hope will come." And I think another way to put it that I really like is hope without action on climate change is as meaningless as thoughts and prayers after a mass shooting. For decades it was considered radical to even accept that climate change was real, but now we're seeing really widespread acceptance that this is our reality and we need drastic action to address it. And really what's being considered radical is actually proposing any sort of action to address the problem. And so, we have a situation where working people not only face lower living standards, growing inequality, and things like that, but we also face uncertainty about if we'll actually have a planet to live on. And I know this was one of the reasons that I became a socialist, and I think for so many young people, this is what is forcing people to take action and to see that, again, the limits of capitalism to, provide any sort of solution. And I think this is also combined with the fact that under capitalism, so often climate catastrophes are actually used as a way to just jumpstart a sort of shock doctrine and increase privatization. So you see in some of these cities like New Orleans or Houston, used as an excuse to kick people out of their homes and convert them into luxury housing, or to ramp up charterization of schools. And I think it's very clear that a solution to climate change will not be done on a for-profit basis. One kind of interesting recent development was Amazon put forward this shipment zero plan that sounds good to have plan for zero climate emissions. It doesn't actually have a plan for reaching net zero climate emissions. It proposes half of their shipments being carbon neutral by 2030, and actually if Amazon continues at the rate of growth that they're currently at, they would still be increasing their climate emissions. And one really inspiring thing is now, I think it's about 8,000 Amazon workers across the country have signed on to a letter saying this is not enough. We need to take action, and really standing up to the limits of Amazon. And yeah, it's in this bigger context that the idea of a Green New Deal is really kind of striking a lot of people's imaginations. Proposed, recently. Amazon, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put forward a plan for a Green New Deal. She's is getting mass support across the country really for the first time, and kind of setting the terms of debate over what kind of action we need. There are definitely limits in the Green New Deal as put forward. It's just a resolution, not a bill, which means that it's not actually binding and just kind of sets priorities for what Congress would do. It calls for meeting 100% of the power demand in the country through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. And I think a lot of the media has focused on it saying that it calls for 100% renewable by 2030, and the resolution itself doesn't actually specify this number, but that is what's being taken up by movements of youth climate strikes and things like that, because that is really what we need. And I think the reason, despite all of its weaknesses, the reason that it's so powerful is because it, people are connecting the need to fight environmental issues with also the need to challenge inequality, that it's not just kind of a thing. Some wealthy people can make some changes in their lifestyle to fix climate change. We need to connect the fight to calls for green jobs, family leave, healthcare, fighting the oppression of women and people of color and immigrants, who are also the people who would be most directly affected by climate change. And despite being, the richest country in the history of the world, none of the basic needs we have for people are actually guaranteed in the U.S. We're told that it would cost too much to, pay everyone a living wage, give people health care, give people a college education, even though there are 3 people in the country who hoard as much wealth as the bottom half of the population, and 100 corporations globally are responsible for over 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's very clear, the burden of addressing climate change should not fall on working people. It should fall on these corporations that are making these massive profits, and be done in the interests of working people. So I think, big question is, what will it actually take to win? The IPCC report estimates that it would cost $900 billion per year to implement the program that is needed to address climate change, and the Green New Deal is modeled on this. The proposal from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposes that this would be paid in part by a 70% marginal tax rate on all income over $10 million, which is a good start, but not nearly enough. I think we will need to tax the major fossil fuel corporations, the big banks, and the financial institutions. And, that's not something that they will accept in any way. It'll take mass movements, and it will really take challenging the power of the richest 1% and the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry over capitalism. But we are seeing, this rise in people taking action. This spring, we saw these climate strikes that people participated in over 100 countries across the world, 1 million people. I think, it needs to go much further, but I think it will, because climate change is not going away. And again, it is not being resolved. I think it's really important that we don't rely, even though it's now kind of becoming a defining issue in the presidential elections for a lot of candidates, that to be a progressive, you have to come out in support of a Green New Deal. Just kind of verbalizing that isn't enough. And we're also seeing huge resistance from the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, with Nancy Pelosi calling it a green dream or whatever. I think really winning a workers' Green New Deal will require our movements and labor especially to not just mistake nice promises from the corporate leadership of the Democrats or the Republicans, which is less likely to happen, but instead actually, working people mobilizing our full power with mass protests, actions, and strikes. Wanted to end by talking a bit about a Green New Deal for Seattle. I think Carol mentioned I work on Shama Sawant's campaign. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative. Shama Sawant has used her office as a socialist to, do things very differently from most politicians to really, organize movements and take direct action. She was involved in the Chi activist protests, blocking the Shell's attempts to set up an oil rig in Seattle, or to duck, and she participated in blocking oil trains, supported Indigenous activists in their really important struggle to divest Seattle from Wells Fargo, which was a big funder of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I think in a city like Seattle, which is generally run by the Democratic Party, everybody will say, we support the environment, of course, we're going to take action. And we want to point towards what that actually would look like. How can Seattle really lead with a Green New Deal here in Seattle? Seattle's political establishment is already failing to meet climate goals that are really not even enough to start out with, goals of reducing climate emissions by half by 2030. And a recent article highlighted that we need to increase the rate of reduction sevenfold to even be on track to meet that. I think we need to lead with being 100% renewable by 2030, which is, again, what we need to address the scale of this problem, and not do this with things like congestion taxes and tolling that place the burden on working people, but actually, fight to tax the rich to fund things like mass transit, making it fully electric and free at point of use, so it's easier for working people to use, and expanding it so that it really is something that can be a part of people's lives. We need to create thousands of living wage jobs by majorly expanding wind and solar energy through the Seattle Public Utilities, retrofitting homes and businesses to the highest energy standards. And I think we need to also really, connect this to fights to make Seattle an affordable place that working people can live. So things like fighting to massively expand social housing, which would need to be funded by taxing big business and Amazon and the rich, and things like rent control to protect people from being pushed out of their homes are connected to this. As people get priced out of Seattle, they have to travel further and further. And I think, again, this is all about making it clear that addressing the environment is not some distant goal, but it needs to be linked to what working people need here and now, as Seattle has one of the highest per capita homelessness populations in the country, or probably the highest, while at the same time Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates each have over $100 billion and live in the Seattle area. They're the only two people in the world to do that. There's this record inequality. And all of this will take building powerful movements to challenge corporate interests. It'll take shifting away from fossil fuels, and it'll take bringing the biggest U.S. energy corporations into democratic public ownership and retooling them for clean energy. I think look forward to this discussion, to talking more about what we're doing and how we can achieve it.
I am speaking for myself and not on behalf of Democratic Socialists of America locally or nationally. I am also not as skilled as the previous speakers, and you might have to put up with my reading my speech. I'm especially interested in the particular challenges that socialists face in confronting climate change. The effects of global warming will probably be managed to avoid complete human extinction. The questions are by whom and for whose benefit, and how many of us will be left. The most vulnerable members of society are being hit harder and will continue to suffer the most unless there is a successful uprising of ordinary people. Challenge number 1. There is a staggering magnitude of physical inertia in the Earth system that underlies the massive scale of action needed to slow and reverse climate change at a meaningful pace. This and other characteristics of the problem are very abstract for most of us in the U.S. So it has been very easy for powerful interests to suppress interest in solving the problem, even though the problem is not abstract for many people who have already been directly affected. Marx and Engels were clear that capitalism tends to destroy its two sources of wealth, nature and human beings. But we belong to nature and exist in its midst. Marx theorized a rupture in the interaction between humanity and the rest of nature. The driving force for capitalists is an endless quest for accumulation of wealth through ever-expanding commodification of resources and ever-increasing commodity production. A state of precariousness for working people's lives, restricted options for fulfilling our wants and needs, and a relentless $1 trillion per year in U.S. advertising coerce our collusion in this. So here we are. Enter the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal envisions utilizing the full power and resources of the federal government to transform U.S. society so that we can rapidly achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, create millions of good jobs, and bring justice and equity to our economy within a capitalist framework. Challenge number 2, it is more profitable to rely on the existing fossil fuel infrastructure than to construct an entirely new alternative energy system. In order to achieve a meaningful slowing and reversing of global warming, trillions of dollars worth of oil reserves must be left in the ground. No means for keeping fossil fuel assets in the ground has been described by the Green New Deal. Paraphrasing John Bellamy Foster, containing emissions means closing down the producers of those emissions. The oil companies, auto manufacturers, power plants, chemical companies, construction companies, airlines, and more, by taking them into public hands so they can be reconfigured. Collective democratic control over the economy, that is, democratic socialism, is needed to prioritize the needs of society and the environment through national and international economic planning. Otherwise, wind and solar energy will simply supplement the status quo use of fossil fuel. Challenge number 3, we need to accept that for the short term, putting pressure on and expanding the reach of the capitalist state is our primary means for bringing about the scale of restrictions and investments needed. And this means in the short term, our power lies in vigorous support for the Green New Deal. In the words of Michael Lowy, a struggle for green socialism means one must try to win time and to impose on the powers that be some elementary changes without any illusions about clean capitalism. Paraphrasing John Bellamy Foster and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, just in order to advance the Green New Deal, mass mobilization and a broad social base are needed. Only the self-mobilization of the population will curtail ExxonMobil's pledge to extract and burn all the fossil fuel assets that they own. According to Thea Riofrancos, the value of the Green New Deal is in shifting the discussion, gathering political will, and underscoring the urgency of the climate crisis. This is not an end in itself, but a pathway to radical transformation must pass through these 3 tests of our political capacity. Because it will be strenuously resisted by the capitalist class, we know that the Green New Deal cannot be won without struggle. We need to grow the socialist movement and act on all fronts to build sufficient power. Our opportunity is to envision and communicate the transformed social arrangements with such clarity that the opportunity to liberate ourselves from capitalist, racist, and patriarchal oppression offers a way out of not just the climate crisis, but out of precarity and poverty and violent conflict. In this vein, the National DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group has gone beyond the Green New Deal by developing specific guiding principles for a just transition that foreshadow additional ways to build the power of ordinary people. The important feature of these principles is democratic control of the new economic infrastructure projects and climate change mitigation projects by the people who are affected, aiming to mobilize and empower them. There's a handout with these guiding principles. I'm not going to go into them in detail, and I apologize for how small the print is. Instead, I want to talk about some resulting priorities for socialists and for the success of the Green New Deal. First is solidarity with labor. A just transition to a sustainable society will involve an unprecedented redeployment of labor and a highly skilled workforce to build a decarbonized economic infrastructure in response to direct investments under the Green New Deal. Paid training and jobs with union scale wages and benefits must be standard under the Green New Deal and offered to all as part of eradicating divisions within the working class and in order to win the support of large and skilled sectors of workers. Our wins must be measured in terms of well-compensated green jobs created, not in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure projects canceled and restrictive regulations passed, even though those are needed. Auto workers whose jobs are already precarious, for example, can become a force for conversion, but not without a Green New Deal. Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon have denied permits for ports that were to be constructed for fossil fuel exports. There are other ports that we need to stop. Where can the compensating green jobs come from, if not through a Green New Deal? Challenge number 4. The mass movement with the capacity to pressure the capitalist state into funding a just transition to a fossil fuel-free economy is also necessary to build the sustainable socialist green new future. So in the process, we need to avoid messaging that envisions green capitalism and embrace anticipatory messaging that builds the long-term struggle for socialism. One of these messages I call uncoupling wealth from economic growth, the liberatory project. Eco-modernist pundits dismiss the suggestions of degrowth with straw man arguments against, quote, austerity ecology. Yet the priorities for the Green New Deal, as described above, while not explicit, are saturated with degrowth outcomes for the capitalist system. Continued economic growth, as currently defined, requires that fossil fuel extraction continue on a scale that will bring about the worst-case climate scenario. Isn't this depressing? Socialist degrowth scenarios will take advantage of opportunities to reduce consumption and a completely different set of priorities based on democratically determined social justice priorities via economic planning. These scenarios logically align with other short-term socialist projects like Medicare for All, free college tuition, and a universal basic income. They also align with liberation from what Marx described as commodity fetishism, which has since been amplified with modern advertising. And there is another glaring reason for democratic socialists to become comfortable with reduced levels of production and consumption. Under the relative security of a democratically controlled economy, how many workers will elect the level of, quote, productivity that requires the harsh conditions coerced under capitalism? Let's find out. And a truly democratically controlled economy means a leveling of inequality, which means some undetermined amount of the wealth of the owning and middle classes in developed capitalist societies needs to be returned to the colonized people from which it was taken, and to the classes suffering the conditions under which what we eat, wear, or work with have been produced. First blood diamonds, now blood computers, made with materials mined under coercion. When workers are empowered, how much of these materials will they elect to mine? Or how many robots will they elect to build to do so? It seems likely that such technology will be produced, just predictably and in general, in much more limited applications, if by a liberated labor force. Socialists can be in the forefront of envisioning liberation from coerced consumption under capitalism, while championing more established socialist liberation projects. Challenge number 5. Even though we live in a world of abundance, under capitalism, precarity is what the vast majority of us experience. Socialists will be challenged to project that emancipation will accompany reduced levels of consumption. Silvia Federici draws on Otto Ulrich in noting that only modern technology's capacity to transfer, that is, externalize its costs over considerable times, such as to future generations, and spaces, and our consequent inability to see the suffering caused by our daily uses of technological devices allow the myth that technology generates prosperity to persist. The capitalist application of science and technology to production has proven so costly in terms of its effect on human lives and our ecological systems that it cannot be generalized. A linking of agroecology and feminism is derided by capitalists and socialists alike as primitivist, but in the context of climate change, we should be interested in the possibility that a renewed value placed on reproductive labor is a potential path to socialist power, not to mention human and ecological renewal. There are several other priorities that I wish I had time to talk about. They are bridging the urban-rural divide while resisting fossil fuel infrastructure projects, civil disobedience, right to water, and the potential for dual power through food sovereignty and regenerative agriculture. In the words of Carl Ries, we have two things in our favor: existential necessity and growing popularity for growing popularity for bold democratic socialist policies. We need to use all levers of influence and power available to us. The Seattle DSA Eco-Socialist Caucus is developing ways to participate in these efforts. Please look at our handouts over there and for our meetings on the DSA calendar at seattledsa.org. And join us. Our next Eco-Socialist Caucus meeting is on Sunday. And feel free to sign the sign-in sheet over there for more from the Seattle DSA. Okay.
This is our little to-do list of the kinds of things we need to get done to prevent full-blown climate disaster. And we can't pick and choose. We got to do all of this stuff. As somebody, I was just reading a good article yesterday, put it, you know, a half a parachute is pretty much as bad as a full parachute. So we can't, for instance, work on renewables and let the fossil fuels still be being pulled out of the ground. We can't ignore that agriculture needs to be revamped because it's a major greenhouse gas source and because there's an opportunity for sequestering carbon in the soil if we do agriculture right. We can't ignore that if we have endless growth and waste, even though we increase renewables, we'll still be producing more and more greenhouse gases. We have to do all this stuff. We have to deal with the military. But there's something else really important we need to do if we're going to have any chance of preventing complete disaster, and that is we need to get beyond capitalism. There really is going to be no chance in hell that we're going to be able to do all the things that need to be done if we stay in this system and we fight within the confines that are allowed to us within this system. There's no way it's going to work. Within capitalism, one of the key features is that we have the major industries owned privately by a few people who get to make the decisions, and they make them for profit. That's how it's organized. So even though the energy industry, the financing industry, the food industry, that determines whether our basic needs are going to be met. It's determining whether we're going to survive. We basically say, here are the reins, and we hand them to a few people who are at the top of these major industries and own it for private profit. Meanwhile, most of us are working for wages, and we find ourselves in a very precarious situation. We are very beholden to a lot of those corporate owners because we need our jobs. And our wages are inadequate because they want to keep the profits up. And all of the things we need, like elder care and child care and health care, cost a whole lot of money because they're handled privately. So we're stressed out, and we don't have the resources we need, and we're subject to extortion. So presumably, the way it works is we're supposed to, all of us, the many, are supposed to be able to control those decisions of the corporate few, the owners of the major industries. But that just doesn't work. It doesn't work because under this system, the profits that are generated when working people go to work don't flow to our coffers and our pockets. They literally, under capitalism, are supposed to flow upwards to the owners of those major industries. So what you end up having is big money. You have owners of major industries accumulating vast piles of money, which they use to make more money and buy more natural resources. And then on top of that, they literally flood the world with misinformation through their PR strategies. And they control elections and legislation, and they buy science, and they own the news media. The list goes on and on. They sue people. If you get something passed, then they make sure it's not enforced. They have all the agencies have their people working for the enforcement agencies. We literally can't get it done. So if we are staying in this system and we are focusing on things like lobbying and like electoral politics, we are not going to be able to do this. I mean, think about this for a second. The fossil fuel corporate giants are not going to voluntarily agree to leave even one iota of fossil fuels in the ground. They're going to get it all out and get all the profits. And we are really stymied in our ability to somehow indirectly force them to do otherwise. Likewise, we need a really big plan to be able to do all this stuff. It's a very complicated, giant thing. And to limit ourselves to having to indirectly influence the people who own things is just suicidal. We're not going to be able to win. We need to get beyond working in this system. The third thing we need to do is we need to fight differently. We need to recognize what our source of power is and use that source of power. We'll get back to that in a second. There is no technological reason that we can't do this. The thing that stands between us and creating the world we want is our confusion. It's our confusion about how things work. We've bought into this idea that since we have 1,000 different campaigns going, we're fighting this pipeline and we're pushing this bill and we're doing consumer choices, that somehow it's all adding up to moving us forward. And the book I wrote was basically the culmination of my realizing, after working in the nonprofit world for decades, that actually we're not moving forward. Because it's very, you just get lulled into thinking, well, we must be moving forward, because you celebrate every little victory. But really, for every victory, there's 1,000 steps backwards. And so, for instance, we can talk about how solar power has increased, but it's still really minuscule. And we can talk about how renewable energy has increased. But all the time that renewables going up, fossil fuels are going up. So we're losing. And we have to look really carefully and honestly at the proposals that are out there. For instance, there's a lot of cities and states that now have pledges and policies that say 100% renewable by such and such a year. So you look at the details, and it turns out, well, it's actually just a section of the greenhouse gases. It's the electricity generation that's being dealt with. And there's about 5 major loopholes there. And most importantly, most of these city and state programs just completely are silent about the fossil fuel extraction and transportation that's happening there. So we're getting fooled by looking at snippets of the picture. When you step back, we're not getting where we need to go, and we can't get where we need to go here. One of the big things that we are confused about is who our friends are. And of course, all of this confusion is fostered by big money spreading misinformation. It's also fostered by the nonprofit industrial complex, which we can talk about later if people want. But one of the big pieces of confusion is that if we elect Democrats, we're going to be able to save ourselves. People talk nostalgically about the Obama climate legacy as if it's a good legacy. But Barack Obama and the Democratic governors who get praised as climate heroes were climate destroyers, absolute destroyers. We had token measures that did very little, and we had massive skyrocketing of oil and gas production during the Obama years under governors and presidents alike who were Democrats. We had oil and gas production go way, way, way up. We had tens of thousands of miles of pipelines built. We had other infrastructure built. We had the U.S. Export-Import Bank funding huge coal plants and other infrastructure in other countries, massive export increases. And basically, we went hurtling backwards, and that's why we're at the edge of the cliff. Those were 8 really precious years, and we totally gave it away by trusting that the Democrats were our friends and we could influence them. And it wasn't the big, bad Republicans blocking things. This was intentional Democratic Party policy, intentional. So we have to stop being fooled, and we have to understand where our real power lies. And it lies in the fact that working people have the power to bring things to a standstill, because society doesn't work if people don't work. So if you look back to the New Deal, that happened because we had a very vibrant labor movement that had mass strikes, and Roosevelt had no choice but to come to the table and make concessions. But the problem is that labor pushed the socialist voices aside and said, we're going to keep capitalism in place. We'll just accept these measures, Social Security and other great things, but we're going to keep the system in place, and we're going to enjoy access to FDR's party. And that's why today the gains that were made, the economic gains, have been completely whittled away by big money. And that's why we're here. It's no exaggeration to say that compromising and saying capitalism was going to continue to be the system of the land brought us the global crisis that we're in on climate. Because if you look at Exxon and Mobil and the other corporations, they clearly knew in the 1960s and probably well before that about global warming. So did they say, oh, we better change course because we don't want to destroy the world? No. They said, let's have a massive disinformation campaign so that anybody who brings this stuff up, everybody thinks they're crazy, and let's get every drop of fossil fuel out of the ground. So we have to learn from this. We can't compromise. We need to be aiming higher, and we need to fight differently. We need to be building a working class movement that is capable of strikes and mass protests that really disrupt, which means that we have to have working people's interests first and foremost in mind, non-negotiable commitment to real jobs for everybody with high wages and free health care and all those things. In general, here's what we need to do. We need to aim higher. We need to say, we need to do all of this stuff. Pieces of this isn't enough. This is what we actually need to do. We need to do this as well, and we need to fight differently. Now, I want to just talk for one more second about this because it's become very popular for people to say, oh yeah, capitalism sucks, down with capitalism, people over profit. But actually, if you look at what they're proposing, it's reinforcing capitalism. So we have to be very clear about what it means to leave capitalism behind. And in particular, we have to be very clear that we are aiming to have public ownership of the major industries. And we want democratic management of them, small d. And we absolutely have to have non-negotiable, first priority, guaranteed economic rights, good jobs, good pay, free healthcare, all that stuff. So we need to be fighting for this, and it really does mean that, and fighting differently, building the working class movement that we need. Now, does that mean that we don't do smaller, incremental kind of things? Not at all. We need to have transitional campaigns and reforms. I totally support standing in front of pipelines and blocking them. But we have to make sure that these strategies really are designed in the context of knowing this is where we have to end up, and we have to end up there pretty fast, and this is the kind of movement we need to build. We can't have them be kind of an afterthought. We can't have what's going on right now, which is people talking about movements, but they're not really talking about building a working class movement capable of strikes and mass disruption. And most of the resources still are going to electing Democrats and lobbying and other kind of incremental things that aren't going to work. So of course we want some transitional things. I personally love the idea of us all getting single payer, improved Medicare for all that would be a great thing. One thing we could all support that's a incremental reform on the way to the full-blown changes that we need is that General Motors is closing down its plants in the United States, some of its plants in the US and in Canada. And there's a feisty group of workers, also Brazil, and there's workers from Brazil and Ontario and Michigan and some other places who are saying, we need to take over these General Motor plants and publicly own them. And you know what? We could make wind turbines and we could make mass transit. So supporting that would be a really classic, great step forward. But we need to do everything in the context of moving forward in this bigger building of a movement. Green New Deal, it's a very important step. It recognizes this is a huge problem, needs a huge solution, talks about those economic issues somewhat. But if you take what's been written in the Green New Deal resolutions, and I'm talking about the Ocasio-Cortez marquee ones, and you hold it up here, it's not even close. I mean, it doesn't deal with most of the stuff on the list. The words fossil fuels don't appear anywhere in the Green New Deal resolutions that have been drafted up to date. So you can be pretty clear that they're not talking about ending fossil fuels. It certainly doesn't leave capitalism behind. In fact, it actually reinforces it with some of the language. So I say we support the Green New Deal concept vigorously, and we take advantage of the opportunity because everybody's gathering around it, but we have to be very clear that it needs to be drastically improved. So what do we need to do specifically from here on out? I put it in 3 different categories. First of all, we each need to tell the truth. We have to admit that what we've been doing is not working and that we need to do all this, and we need to get beyond capitalism and fight differently. So we have to stop talking about things like, oh, I'm really psyched because we got the price of solar cells to go down. That's not our goal. Our goal is to deploy the solar cells, period. We're not like just trying to have some kind of market change. And for instance, we don't want to keep saying, we want to hold corporations accountable. I don't want to hold corporations accountable. I want to own the industry and call the shots. So we got to change our language and aim much higher and be much stronger. The second thing we have to do is find each other. And I would urge everyone here to please join System Change, Not Climate Change. I have a little thing on the table over there about how to do that. There's no membership fee, there's no staff, there's no budget. It's just a network, Canadian-US network, and it brings together people who agree with this general socialist, eco-socialist perspective, people who are members of different socialist organizations, people who are free-floating. So it's a place where we can talk about what our strategy is going to be. And then the third thing is, whether you join System Change or not, focus on building the working class movement and being very clear that we're not winning under this system and we can't win, and that our power lies in having working people stand up and use the power that we really have. So that's what I have to say, and we will now open it up for a discussion.
So the question was, I mentioned that rare earth metal mining is problematic with solar panels, and what alternative would I propose? So what I would say is that I think there is a way to mine rare earth metals safely and a way to mine it without environmental damage. The environmental damage that occurs now is an accumulation of acidic wastewater, which destroys local wildlife. There's an area in China called, like, I can't remember what it is in Chinese, but it's essentially the land of the deer, and it's now a misnomer because they don't live there anymore. Everybody who lived there before, all of the animals, the people, they're all gone because the water there is so poisoned, so toxic that nothing can live there anymore. So the reason why this mining is done in such a terrible, environmentally damaging way is because the companies that do it have no incentive to pay for the damage that they're causing or to prevent it, because that would cost them more. It would eat into their profits. And in fact, the way that this mining is done now requires the use of Tibetan slaves. So, I mean, we can imagine the kind of conditions that have to be done if they're not even able to pay people wages to do this, So that's my answer is it can be done, just not under capitalism.
There was a raging debate on a listserv at the national level of System Change about this, with some people saying, yeah, but you compare to the rare earth metals in fossil fuels that they're higher. Anyway, I think it's a real problem that needs to be addressed, but I think there's also some of this stuff with the fossil fuels that maybe it reduces from.
Yeah, it's not a knock against renewable energy. We definitely need it. I'm just saying that, if we constrain ourselves to capitalism, we can't solve it. There's demonstrable ways that we can prove that.
And it can be comments as well as questions.
Thank you guys for speaking. I was super inspired by your big picture goals to have public ownership of major industries. Do you have any case studies from where that's worked, like a transition from privately owned to publicly owned industries? Or from private to public?
Well, before in World War I and World War II in this country, the federal government did take over railroads and telegraph and some other industries and transformed them for the war effort. So we have that model. In France and probably other countries, there's definitely been public ownership of different industries. I think it was actually kind of right-wing folks in France decades ago who made public a bunch of different industries, and then they had this period called the golden era or something where people were doing well, and then they gradually got privatized, and now we're at the yellow vest stage again. But there's a lot of private ownership all over the place because the dominant economic system is capitalism around the planet. So there's people talking about doing it, and we have those examples. But I think there's people here who might have more to say about this too. Do you mind doing it up here so we can record
I'll
it?
just say it out loud so anybody can hear. Yes, of course, the oil companies are a very popular thing to be taken over by the government and subsequently collapse, as is right now amply demonstrated by both Venezuela and Mexico. I'm not sure this is the method that you want to go, but yes, it's certainly yes.
Also, Norway.
The
Norway
outputs
owns.
collapse.
Yeah,
Norway owns the oil industry.
Norway owns the oil industry. And I think an important thing to notice is we do need democratic management. We're not talking about, an undemocratic situation. We're talking about that's what we need to be discussing and figuring out how to make sure that that's what we have is grassroots up planning so that we do things well. But I would like the oil industry to go away. So as long as we take care of the workers, I'm fine with it collapsing.
In terms of history, in this country, of course, you have the populist movement, which was the most fundamental radical movement in the country, and it started with economic literacy among farmers in Texas and controlled a lot of the prairie states and had massive co-ops, banks, their own banking structure are huge, and it's a history we need to know to realize there is this history in America. The Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, there is still a state bank in North Dakota out of the Nonpartisan League in the 1910s. There's a state insurance company in Wisconsin out of the progressive era in Wisconsin. So there is a lot of history along the way, and not to mention all the co-ops, plywood co-ops in Washington State in the 30s and 40s.
And a lot of countries have publicly owned healthcare, variations on that, which works a hell of a lot better than our system.
I got into socialism because I got really into environmentalism, but I'm also an environmental science student, and the more I learn about the current issues that our climate and planet are facing, the more I learn that the traditional view of socialism might not necessarily be enough. So I was wondering what key differences would there be in a view of an eco-socialist future versus a view of a traditional socialist future? That's for anyone.
I come to this from not being a socialist, but being an environmentalist who realized, so I'm going to let the people who are, including people in the audience who are mired in socialist traditions, speak about that.
Well, I might be a little naive about this too, but I'll just say a couple things. One is that Marx was in awe of capitalism and its productive capacity, and so that kind of kicked off an uncritical view of productivism, which is a label that gets put on traditional Leninist parties. So Lenin and Stalin, really had a legacy of trying to keep up with the West in terms of production. Well, if you're trying to keep up with a system that coerces labor, then you're going to have to do the same thing, I think. This is my personal view. This is not a very learned view. But so, in fact, that's why I talked about So the kinds of things that I was talking about get a label of eco-austerity. You know, degrowth gets this label of eco-austerity from productivist Marxists. And we do need to rebel against that, in my opinion. How about you? The sort of tradition of envisioning the post-cap, socialism as to be as productive in the same sense that capitalism is, which isn't really productive.
Yeah, so maybe I don't know what you mean exactly by traditional, but assuming you mean like what we would call like socialist states, which isn't really like, so like the vision of a socialist society is one without a state necessarily, because supposedly you've eliminated classes and states are a way for you to mediate class conflict, so you don't need it. But the socialist states like the USSR, China, etc., do have a terrible environmental record. That's undisputable. Like some of the worst environmental destruction has taken place under the USSR. But we should not look at those countries as necessarily a model. And so the reason why those countries ended up having these sorts of problems is because, like she said, they were trying to compete with the West. And the reason why they were trying to compete with the West is because they were unable to foment an international revolution in the beginning. So if you are an isolated socialist revolution, you're going to be attacked on all sides from capitalist countries, because if the workers win in one country, then that scares like everybody else, right? That's why there was this like big Red Scare in the United States, because they saw what the Bolsheviks had done, and they were like, oh my God, if our proletariat, raises up against us, then what are we going to do? So I think like the difference is that it has to be an international, and that we need to look beyond military conflict as a way to resolve problems. Because if we're trying to, and another important difference is that it needs to be from below. The workers need to actually maintain control. If the workers, if there becomes this like upper caste of like party members and the rest of the working people, then you've just created a different form of capitalism or some kind of like degenerated worker state. There's a lot of disagreement about what that is, but then you're not going to win.
Right, and in terms of terminology, some of us wouldn't really think of it as being socialist if it didn't have true democratic management. The USSR had an attempt at socialism which was derailed, partly because so many countries invaded.
Yeah, I'm not sure too if this is what you're getting at, but like the idea, I was kind of unclear what Marxism or socialism was, and kind of thought of it as like every country just like develops in this linear manner, goes through, a system of capitalism, and then socialism will happen after. And I think, there's this impending climate catastrophe that, there's not resources in the world for that to happen, but that doesn't mean there aren't resources in the world for everybody to like have a standard of living. And I think, I think the idea that having a society that is run in the democratic interests of working people is what's really important. And so like development on an environmental basis, I think is, very much compatible with the socialism I agree with. And I think it's really the idea of like, who is deciding these things. And like right now we have climate scientists and stuff like that, but our policy does not actually represent that in any way. And, we saw the March for Science being a kind of start in protesting against that. I think, questions like how we develop solar panels or stuff like that, I'm not a scientist and I don't know exactly the best answer to that question, but I think it's about having those questions decided by, scientists and people who know best, and actually having that be the priority. I think it was absurd, like after Hurricane Maria, that this country that has this great natural abundance was left without power for months on end, and people died because of it. And so I think, my idea of socialism, that is, running society democratically in the interest of working people. I think we need to reject the idea too that there's just like a scarcity or like not enough room on the planet for people to live, but it's actually about the for-profit model, which is, extracting these resources, and people are hoarding wealth while other people are in poverty.
Do you want to be the caller?
Yeah, sure. Let me, Damien.
I was gonna add a little context on the work that some eco-socialists have done probably since the 80s, rescuing actually a lot of lesser-known writings by Marx, and debunking this myth that Marx himself was this person that never really considered these questions about the environment. John Bellamy Foster has written a lot about it. Paul Burkett, and Michel Louis. And if you want like all of these names, go to Climate and Capitalism. That's a really good blog, climateandcapitalism.com. For like, that's where I learned a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of recent books that I think we should like go and have study groups on to really like get away from this, idea that there's somehow an original sin within Marxism, and really look at the historical conditions that led to, the USSR, China, to become like capitalist and productivist states.
Did you want to speak still?
Okay. So I think Carol is a dear, dear friend of mine. I will say that before this, just very brief thought, is that leaving capitalism behind, and mind you, I'm not an active member of any social group. I've been an environmental reporter for many, many years. I do my best on all sorts of issues, from helping refugees at the border and doing immigration defense work. But why does it have to be such a huge, huge task? Why to say yes? What we have to do is we have to leave capitalism behind. Here we live in the most monstrous capitalist society of all time. Why bite off that massive task and instead not engage in all the multiple things that are feasible and capable of being achieved? Why is that the greatest umbrella that has to be deflated and crushed for anything else to occur? Because there are multiple things happening across the front, across the planet, that are very, very positive. Yes, they are minute, and yes, Carol definitely debunks that that's good enough. But yet, if I were to walk out of here and say what I must do is get capitalism crushed, it's completely impossible, completely beyond my capacity, and so I would stop doing anything at all.
Okay.
So that's my
Well, we definitely need to have transitional things, but it needs to be in this context. I would ask you, well, first of all, the reality is that we have been deluding ourselves. We feel good about all those things we're doing and the little victories, but we have to be honest and look at, and that's what I do in my book, this illusion that we all had. And if you look at the numbers in all sorts of ways, not just on environment, but on all sorts of other fronts, if you're actually moving backward, you have to know that, even if it hurts. You just really have to face it. But I'm not saying personally that you don't do things like go and be at a Wells Fargo bank or go block a whatever. You have to do it in this context. And the bigger question is, it seems like a huge, huge thing to leave capitalism behind. Of course it is. But a really bigger thing is this idea that you could actually solve the climate crisis within capitalism. That's really the crazy thing. I mean, it seems crazy hard to create a system where we have democracy and we actually own these industries, but there are people who are mapping out how you do that. And we have to build, to do the things on that first list, we would have to build the mother of all movements. We would have to be so massively organized in a movement way. Why would we do all that and have that power and then say, okay, we'll do these few things here and we won't take down the system and therefore any gains we make will be lost? I mean, it's so gigantic to deal with the climate crisis that you have to build a movement. Why would you not use that movement to actually take power? It is virtually impossible to solve the crisis and not go over the cliff within this system. It really is virtually impossible, and we just have to acknowledge that. I'm not sure I really answered it all that well, but do you guys want to comment on this?
Do you want
I think that there's just a minutia misunderstanding, Carol, because I'm all for all of these things, but it's just that I'm going to keep on working on the first list. And as far as leaving capitalism behind, yes, that's inherent. That's a given. But I don't see that necessarily happening unless you are a part of the inner core that's in this room, who are in strong socialist movements, who talk and read and discuss this all the time. I'm not in that world. And so how do we draw people like me who do as much as I can, yet I'm not a part of the socialist movement per se? How do we do that simultaneously? I don't know.
Well, that's why we're having this forum, and I'm encouraging people to get plugged into that network so we can have that conversation. And socialism is really gathering interest.
could you?
Yeah, just real quick on the question of Marx and the environment. I think when the Russian Revolution took place, a lot of times people don't know this. In the early years, when the workers actually were in control, from 1917 on, they made big steps towards not only women's liberation, national liberation, etc., but also on the question of ecology. They really did a lot of study on that and began to set aside areas and that kind of stuff. That was reversed when the Stalinist counter-revolution took place and a new state capitalist class took power in Russia. But for a few years, they were allied with ecology, and that makes perfect sense. If people are actually in democratic control of their lives, they're not going to want to destroy the earth. They're going to want their children in the future to be able to live in this world. And so it makes perfect sense, I think, that if you have a democratic society that was thoroughly democratic from the bottom up, people would want to preserve the earth. And that's what began to happen in the Russian Revolution before the counter-revolution. Then just one thing in general, I think all of this stuff is great. I think Carol's list is fantastic. However, we're up against the obstacle of the capitalist state. And the people who have the power in the society, both economically and politically, are not going to give it up. They're not going to be outvoted. They're not all of that kind of stuff. It's going to take a revolution to replace the current state and also the current economic structure. And that may seem like a daunting task, but capitalism goes into crisis, and when it does, the possibility opens up for a revolution to take place and overthrow the whole system. But if we're not organized for that ahead of time, we're not going to be ready to do that. So I think it's important to be involved in all of the various movements, but also to organize in the long run for an actual socialist revolution that can transform the whole system. Because otherwise, we're just not going to get there. Just one thing on public ownership, I think it's great, but if it's within the capitalist system, it can be totally subverted. So you look at the post office, kind of publicly owned, horrible place to work, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's many, many other examples of that kind of stuff.
But isn't it also like a revolution of the very way that we live, the way we consume, right? To end fossil fuels, we sort of have to do everything sort of differently. We can't get things from China, like the steel and the cell phones, We can't even, I don't think we can even really smelt steel. We have to do things, we very, very differently. We have to live very, very differently, and I think I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said there as well. I don't really want to say it right now, but yeah.
The guy in the back. Okay.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm Alex. I'm a socialist down in Tacoma. I rode my bike to get here, so I did my part. Don't worry. I wanted to go a little bit at the. Oh, first off, when I look at the literature table, Bellamy Foster is there, Burkitt is there. I didn't see any Lowry, but I totally agree. Marx's Ecology is the first place to go, in my opinion. I mean, the Green New Deal. I appreciated the final panelist a lot on emphasis on class struggle. But I think that there's a really important dynamic to the popularity of the Green New Deal in that it tackles a major problem in the U.S. labor movement and the environmental movement, and that is the jobs versus the environment debate, right? That has led labor again and again in this country to fall on the wrong side of questions around pipelines, around other projects, and I think that the idea of the Green New Deal, that an a just transition has always been the socialist answer, right? Of like, there is no actual jobs versus environment issue here. We want green jobs. We want a just transition where everyone has good green union jobs, weatherizing everything, producing mass transit, etc. And yet there's a contradiction in our society where this new socialist movement that exists, that includes millions of people who are socialists, who want socialism, aren't necessarily socialist activists, right? They do see the Green New Deal and sort of the political maneuver as the answer. And I think that a real important job for socialists is to actually connect the issues like the Green New Deal and these political fixes to the labor struggle that can actually win them. The teacher strikes of last year are so clearly the example where labor and politics came together. Teachers all around the country struck around political issues about how we fund our schools, right? About whether our schools have libraries, whether our schools have nurses, and they won. Arizona teachers won $400 million increase to the school budget, right? I mean, it's incredible. And that's a political demand, right? And I think you start to get at, there's other examples. There's the teachers doing the Black Lives Matter work with Black Lives Matter in schools. There's an example of occupying the GM plants, but there's so much potential in this new socialist movement, in this new labor movement, and the increase in the environmental movement around the Sunshine Movement, the Yellow Vest movement, and really the key question for socialists, I think, is how to connect it to industrial labor. And I don't know how to do it, but that's the crux of it, right?
One of the lies that climate deniers tell, and that the defenders of the status quo tell repeatedly to try to debunk that climate change is, or that addressing climate change is even possible. They'll say, well, if you're going to really address climate change, if you're really going to tackle that list, you're going to live like paupers. You're going to go back to pre-industrial society. You're going to live terrible, poverty-stricken lives. And it's simply not true. So I think we have to be very careful how we frame things when we say we're for socialist degrowth, we're for conservation and ending growth in general. I think the way they trip us up is they get people thinking about standard of living instead of what we should be thinking about is quality of living. Standard of living is a capitalist measurement. If you have 20 tubes of toothpaste, you have a higher standard of living than someone that has 10 tubes of toothpaste. But we don't care about that stuff, and we have to be crystal clear about this and not fall for that argument. National health care for all, single-payer health care for all, guaranteed jobs for all at union wages, mass transportation that's free and efficient and available everywhere with bullet trains from every major city and every other major city across the country. If we had some of those things and more, and a national energy grid that was sustainable, and yet we could only have one television per household or one tube of toothpaste or fewer choices of cereal, that is not a decline in our quality of life. That is a tremendous improvement in our quality of life. And we should never let them get away with framing the argument that way. I think we have to be very careful about that. On Martha's question, how do we get to the big issue of getting rid of capitalism when there's so many little things to fight and it seems so daunting? the way I look at it is we fight all the little fights, always, anytime we can. But in figuring out how to organize, to fight the daily fights that we all face under the climate issue or other issues, we should be thinking about, is the strategy I'm choosing to organize to forward this particular fight going to help lead me to the place where we need to go? Is it going to help people understand that, A, we need to act independently of the two capitalist parties, the Democrats and Republicans? Is it going to help people understand that really the system's the problem and it's not just a smaller issue? Yes, we fight for those smaller issues, but everything should be thought of in terms of how do we use those fights to advance the greater understanding of where we really need to go. Capitalism is, we've heard Wall Street compared to a casino. Well, capitalism is a giant casino. And you go to a casino and you cannot beat the house. It doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter if you think it's unfair. It doesn't matter if you complain or you stomp your feet. The rules are such that you can't beat the house. That's capitalism. You cannot beat the house. We need to get rid of it entirely. But yes, we fight all the fights, the daily fights, and always with the goal in mind of how do we turn this fight into something bigger.
So what concerns me is, I lived in Lawrence, Kansas in the 90s, and I lived and worked at a cooperative, and they were talking about control, like to get your own radio station, you need $100,000. And then if you want to own a news station, you have to have millions and billions of dollars. And then what they're producing for like the masses to consume is absolute garbage to like fracture us. And like, what do we come together to watch? Nobody's showing melting icebergs on the polar caps or people mining this. It's all just garbage to distract us. So my question is, for these waves of movements of like the yellow vest and green jobs and public education, there's no rubric of truth to this information. It's like actually ecologically like dispelling toxic waste on our televisions. So it's like, how do we somehow, since we're disenfranchised with no money, how do we create quality programming? I mean, public TV's okay, but I'm just concerned at the global conversation that radiates from televisions and certain newspapers.
So the hard answer is we organize with the people who are working there, convince them to overthrow their boss, and then, create a left wing in the union, and then get them to put out the actual truth of what's happening. In terms of like what we can do in the short term, I don't know. We can make protests that are big enough to the point where if they don't cover it, then, they look totally stupid. We can make strikes that are big enough to the point where they have to cover them. But another thing that we can do, one of the most important things that we can do is to have our own press that's funded by working people. Because obviously, yes, the media is against us. The media will never cover things in the way that it needs to be covered. It's not like on the front pages of every newspaper they're saying we need to end capitalism. But that's exactly what we need to do, right? So we need to have our own printing press. We need to have our own voice and media out there that's like putting this message out there to build our movement.
I would be interested, well, first of all, thanks so much for all of your talks. Definitely learned a lot. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how people should interact with the current Green New Deal resolution, Ocasio-Cortez's resolution, and the movement that's supporting it, and also your responses to what each other think about that.
Talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, we saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. One of the first things she did, I think, right after being inaugurated, was participate in a sit-in Nancy Pelosi's office with the Sunrise Movement, which I think is really notable. That is really different from what most politicians do. But then kind of at the same time or right after that, voted for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House. And I think this really points to the need for working people to have our own political organization, you know, that really has a strong program for lots of these things we've talked about, including a Green New Deal. And, you know, I think we should be clear, though, that a Green New Deal is not going to happen by working with the current structures of the Democratic Party. The corporate leadership is going to massively oppose it. You saw like Mitch McConnell's and the Republican strategy was trying to force it to a vote to kind of try to make it dead in the water. And I think it was nobody in the whole Congress or Senate who voted for it. And, you know, they kind of blamed it on, you know, this is the Republican strategy. But again, we need really our own form of organization to fight for these things. And I think also, you know, I think that is a way with what's come up earlier tonight of, you know, how do we link together these various struggles, or like, what does it, you know, how do you consider if something is taking things forward or not? And I think it really does all depend on, you know, is it, does it take working people getting organized and kind of challenging the current system of things? Even like the $15 minimum wage here in Seattle, you know, that is something that is ultimately acceptable under capitalism. But it took standing up to the political establishment. And again, you know, winning a Green New Deal, even as limited as it is right now, would take a massive fight against the fossil fuel industry.
I don't know if somebody from the Sunrise Movement might talk about this because
He's
honestly,
Sunrise.
oh yeah, because I'm just really in awe of the work that you're doing, and to me, you really are in the lead on the Green New Deal fight, and I'd like to know what your advice to us is on that, making it happen. What's next?
Do you want us to answer?
I could. I was kind of interested to hear this.
Yeah,
the
the
panelist
answer, okay.
answers, though,
Okay.
but I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I? Oh, are you still?
You can go if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, after you. So, I mean, I definitely want to be talking to folks like you. Come to Sunrise meetings and talk about all this stuff and do a lot of talking. And I hope people might see the System Change Network as a place where we can talk about that. One thing specifically I would really like to have happen would be that we get a real deal planning team going, some kind of process. There are other people who have talked about, let's envision what the world should look like. But I don't know of any process where people who want to start from the idea that we actually own stuff and everybody has jobs and health care, what does it look like? So I would love to have Sunrise people and people from all sorts of groups be part of a program, a project, people from tribes, people from the most affected communities, people from different unions, to talk about Washington State and maybe the region and say, okay, we've got this fossil fuel. If that goes away, where do those jobs come from? Do we need more teachers? Yeah. Do we need more elder care? You know, real specific mapping out what it would look like. Does Boeing start manufacturing mass transit? And I think that that would be a valuable Green New Deal kind of procedure that would lead to something more powerful.
So can you repeat the question? Like,
I was curious to hear your thoughts on how people should interact with the Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal resolution and the movement that's supporting it, and also your like responses to each other's perspectives.
yeah. So in general, I would say, like, as a socialist, you should critically support it. And that what that means is that we should recognize that it is progressive, that if it were passed and those things actually were done, it would be great. It would be a good step forward. But we also need to understand that it's not enough. You know, that even if we won everything on the farthest left side there, if it's still under capitalism, we're going to be fighting for it every single day until we overthrow the system and stop the system from trying to reemerge as like the dominance of capital and destroying the environment and all the other problems that we're facing today. In terms of like what you said about the vote. I think it was passed by the House because the House is now controlled by Democrats. But in the Senate, the Republicans like forced a vote on it before debate could happen, and then the Democrats, like 3 of them, voted against it, and then the whole rest of them voted present, which means that they just kind of stood there and said, "Yeah, I'm here. I'm not voting for it, though." You know, so, and I mean, I'm not surprised. Like, in terms of like what it would look like here, I think what Carol said makes sense. But it's going to take like a really organized movement for us to win, even like the smallest little bit, you know. Like we don't even have taxes on companies really. Like Amazon doesn't pay taxes. Just imagine that. This is like mind blowing, right? They don't pay a cent in taxes.
They made money actually in taxes.
Yeah.
So about the Green New Deal, I'm curious. Like I agree that the Green New Deal definitely isn't enough, but from your perspective as socialist activists, is it beneficial to like actively engage in fighting for the Green New Deal, or would it be more beneficial to actively fight against capitalism in general?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's totally worth fighting for. Sign me up. And as far as, I mean, it seems like we're headed, to me, it seems like we're headed toward, we need to get bigger. Just keep growing. You're growing, right? The Sunrise Movement is?
Yeah.
Yeah, and DSA is growing. Just keep growing, and in order to grow, we need to do stuff. So we need demonstrations, sit-ins like you already did, and be more and more disruptive, I think, in, you know, like proportional to how big we are, you know what I mean? Because you can't like declare a march on Washington and have, you know, only 10,000 people show up. But, you know, as we grow, bigger and bigger and more disruptive, pressure. We have to put pressure on the system. And honestly, I do think of Vietnam, you know, I mean, you have no idea how disruptive the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War was, and it you know, stumbled to the finish line and, you know, arguably shortened the war, but it needs to be on that scale.
I would say that, like in terms of are we fighting capitalism or are we fighting for the Green New Deal, I would say that in fighting for the Green New Deal, we are fighting against capitalism.
Yeah.
Because all of the reforms that they put in there, like a guaranteed job, family sustaining wage, like nobody who owns a company likes this, you know, nobody. So when we're fighting for those things, that's against the interests of the capitalists. And, you know, so a fight for the environment is a fight against capitalism. That's all I'm going to say.
I would love to encourage you to be, as you get bigger and more sophisticated over time, to up your demands and to have major protests and anger when the sellouts happen and when the votes happen that don't pass and when Pelosi is voted for. To be engaged and just lobby and not be clear that you really want a stronger program. One of the phrases in, I mean, there isn't like a Green New Deal. It's like resolutions and committees that might do stuff. But one of the phrases in one of the main documents from Ocasio-Cortez and Markey's office that kind of concerns me is that there's a desire to spur massive growth in clean manufacturing and to limit greenhouse gases, quote, as much as is technologically feasible. I can tell you from 25 plus years of working on this stuff, that little phrase, as much as technologically feasible, means that this is going to be used to promote manufacturing, expanding greenhouse gas production. So, you know, that's just one example. And, you know, you should be, you know, pushing for it and celebrating that there's this big vision and we're talking about economic stuff and constantly pushing harder and getting more and more people lined up with you to support an ever stronger vision of what it is you want.
And work on the labor movement, because we will be pitted against the labor movement, as you may have noticed.
Yeah, I think the point that was raised earlier is really fundamental. That the Green New Deal, it does actually offer a path towards, bridging the labor versus the environment that so often happens. And there was like this AFL-CIO Energy Committee had this letter that circulated against the Green New Deal, and I think you should recognize this doesn't represent the positions of all workers, and that's a small section. And the Green New Deal, it does specifically talk about the need to support unionization and family wage jobs and workers' rights, and I think this is what offers a path forward truly for the environmental movement. And I think even these climate strikes across the country, they're just really a start. But these are people who will join the workforce and will have a lot of power. And I think just that whole idea is really important. And I think it's important to not be too dismissive of that.
Yeah. And I would really love to know your thinking if you're mapping out what you're going to do at the next point, at the various points where they sell you out. Sorry, but I've done this a long time. Do you have your strategy lined up of, what you're going to do next and how you're going to keep the pressure on? And if you win something, how you're going to, there's going to be all sorts of forces, including, I think there's a connection between Sunrise and Sierra Club. I've been trying to figure out how you guys get formed. Anyway, Sierra Club, it has a history of like vast celebration of any step forward in a way that makes everybody feel, oh good, we solved that problem. So thinking through whether you're going to be just right there saying, well, that was nice, it's entirely inadequate, and now we need this, planning your strategy. I really would like to hear more what you're thinking.
Isn't something like inherently flawed, though, about thinking about things so electorally with the Green New Deal, as we kind of are talking about it? Like, we've been talking a lot about voting and House of Representatives and stuff like that just now, I feel like getting the voting and doing sit-ins and demonstrations to try to get the government to change its actions is sort of like, is in a lot of ways like trying to get a business to give an inch, and because the government is incredibly capitalist in our country inherently, and I feel like a lot of ways is I think we're talking way too electorally about this. Like a Green New Deal, I think is a really good framework, but we have to do a lot of these things sort of for ourselves, against the system, of course, but it feels like a little bit too within the system in the way we're talking about it right now.
I think we had said this was going to go till 8:45, but in any case, we're supposed to be done with the room at 9, and it's like almost 10 of. I think maybe we should wrap up so there's enough time for people to talk to each other and look at the tables, and sign up for things so we can keep this discussion going. Because times are changing. There is this, the Sunrise, the Youth and Energy, the Greta Thunberg, all these new groups that are forming outside the traditional bounds of things are really encouraging. So thank you all for coming, and please keep in touch. Sign up.